Hi, I'm Bryan Parys. I'm a writer. My book Wake Sleeper came out this past fall, and I have been writing and teaching for the last 10 years, and also work at Berklee College of Music as a writer and editor in Boston. It was amazing. I mean, it was a 3-year program that was funded by a teaching assistantship. So I was teaching composition and intro to creative nonfiction writing, kind of off and on that whole time. And I had never even heard of the genre creative nonfiction before I was applying to programs, and was a big fan of David Sedaris at the time, and didn't know that's what it was called. And through research, found that program, saw that name, and thought that's what I've been doing. That's what I've been writing, and didn't know it. So I applied for that, got it, and it was amazing. It was like this whole lid opened, and all these writers, some of which I had known and loved, and didn't know how to brand in terms of genre. And so it was very much like this "I belong here" moment, and so that education of just reading deeply into, for me, what was really into was the lyric essay and sort of hybrid poetry, nonfiction. So I think a lot of times people think of memoir and nonfiction as the true version of fiction, and that never rang true for me. And once I discovered that there was this sort of hybridity, there was this work on the margins, which writers are marginal anyway, and being someone with a faith background in a non-Christian program was already feeling like another layer of that, but in a really healthy way. So it was very much like a homecoming of these are my people, and yeah, it was really good, really empowering. In terms of the content, I knew I was going to write about growing up Christian, and I wondered how is this going to go over at a school like UNH, and I found it to be so good. And it was the first time that I had been outside of Christian education since kindergarten, and I was really struck by how moved people were by the work, how much they wanted to talk about it, and when they kept coming back to saying this isn't a Christian book, this is a human book, and that was really big for me, because that's what I had set out to do that. And when you're using a linguistic framework that references Christian touch points, I think people they get standoffish, they get a little nervous if that's not their background. And I learned there, it's like, well, if I'd grown up on a farm, I would be using farm terms. Tractors would be making appearances as opposed to references to Sunday school or whatever it was, or denominations. So that was a really good training ground for me, just to kind of say this isn't just a subculture book. This is a search for meaning, and it's bigger than I think what some people were telling me that it might be. It probably is like the searching or seeking memoir. The idea of writing a memoir for me was not something I was interested in right away because of the word and the connotations. I think that it tends to be a little pulpier, more confessional, less about making connections with a wider world and having people relate. I think a lot of times it can be, this is my story and I need to tell it. Which in one sense is really important, but in another can get lost in that world between journaling and literature. But when I realized that memoir was really, in essence, about seeking, and the term essay, which comes from the French to try or to attempt, or to make an attempt, I realized that memoirs didn't have to have tight conclusions, that they were really about forming better questions. And they should be about a discovery process. You shouldn't set out to write an essay or a memoir where you feel like you know where you want to end up. And that was really huge for me. So the writing itself should be a discovery process, and if it is, I feel like that's a good test for whether it will be a discovery point for readers. For me, the discovery process was very much in small, sort of nerdy English majory things. It was about verb tense. I was writing in the past tense, and again, just trying to be David Sedaris and mimic this voice of kind of small humor, like small things, unintentional things being really hilarious. And it was, some of those things would land, but in the end, it kind of felt a little pandering and a little empty. And also part of it is I hadn't really reckoned with the story of my father's passing when I was 4. And so when I started to press into that a little more, I had read my mentor's book in grad school, Meredith Hall, as a memoirist. Her book was in the present tense, and she was kind of encouraging our workshop to try it out. So I did, and it was huge. I mean, it was like a transportational experience where I would sit down to write a chapter. You're not totally maybe having an idea. I'm going to write about sort of discipline, the times that my school gave out spankings. I'm going to write about that. And you can kind of guess what kind of message might come out of that, but I also didn't want to make a statement. I thought I wanted it to be more nuanced. I wanted it to be a human thing. And writing it in the present tense totally changed how the previous draft had come in. And it was this very distinct moment where I was writing at a table in my apartment, and it just went for hours, and the sun went down, and my wife got home from work and kind of came in, opened the door, closed it, normal sounds in a very quiet room that should get your attention, and I just didn't even notice. Because I was there. There's something about the present tense that brings you back to the moment. My mentor called it tunneling. So now you're in this moment, and you've brought yourself back to that. You sort of pause the camera in your brain to see the room, and oftentimes these familiar rooms, you've been there for a long time, so you don't need perfect memory to guess what shape the room's in or what color might be there or what color the carpet is or the smell. So you can render that detail, and that brings you closer and closer into what's happening there, and that's where the actual discovery starts coming from. So the next paragraph jumps to something you don't quite know, because you've got two writers happening there. You've got the part that you're reliving, and you've got this more experienced human person that you are now, the writer being the reflector over that stuff. So in a sense, the reflection becomes embedded. It's integrated with the content itself. So you're not separating and be like, here's this thing that happened to me. Funny thing happened to me on the way to the spanking room, and then you reflect later, what does it mean to spank a child? I didn't want it to do that. I wanted it to be all in one. And for me, the present tense just exploded it, and I never turned back. I found the past tense to be a letdown, because there's a sense of the past tense that you've learned something. And again, I think there's somewhat of an act of hubris that most people think in writing a memoir, especially when you're young. And for me, I think the past tense is where that comes from, because it's like, I've taken this away and I have this lesson for you, reader. Why don't you take this and improve your life? Whereas I think the present tense is more open and it's more nuanced, and it's saying, come into the mess and discuss it and live it with me, and I'll kind of guide you through this process so that you can ask those questions yourself and relate to it in whatever way you can. So and actually, more recently, I've been diving more into the hybrid form and doing more with poetry, which I don't really think about tense that much or them, but it's definitely still kind of present tense. Yeah, the structure of the book was really difficult at first, because in my graduate program, it was kind of like a new chapter every 2 weeks or a new essay. Most people in my workshop were not writing a book or a solid memoir. I came in with a very clear idea of wanting and needing to write this book, which is fine. I think normally they encourage you not to have a project, but I was, and so that was my impetus for getting this finished. Was every 2 weeks I got to have the makings of a chapter, and I didn't think about how it would fit. I was just trying to make it, be a complete experience for the workshop group, so that they don't misdirect their comments with what could have happened. Like, oh, well, some plot point or something like that. I really tried to make it so that it felt complete. And then all of a sudden I had, 15 or 16 of these, and I had to start thinking about in my final year, how do these fit together? And I had a sense for how that was going to work, but it wasn't always coming across to other people that were reading it. They're like, well, you jump around, you're 7 in this moment, and by the end of the chapter, you're 22. And then the next chapter starts and you're in 3rd grade again, and so how is that going to work? So I had been learning a lot with the lyric essay form and the collage format, and a lot of people use this, and I think it's less experimental than it sounds. I mean, Wikipedia is a collage format. People jump naturally from link to link without finishing sentences, and they don't feel like they've lost a complete experience. So I knew that I could get away with breaking away from chronology and moving to a more thematic structure, where you would have a felt sense of me growing up over the course of the book, but it wouldn't be directly tied to time. And that was also a big choice too, because time, when you're growing up Christian, you're introduced to this idea of eternity from a really young age. And I think for some people it's so abstract they don't think about it if they're young. For me, my dad's passing when I was 4, kind of right when I'm coming into hardwired memory and really being able to have that, I'm also being introduced to this concept of things never ending. But the only evidence I have for anything is that there is an end. So that kind of played with my sense of time. And so when I went back to write the book and was really writing that, I'd always felt like I was picking up some giant tarp or tent or something, and all these things were swirling around inside, and I would take one out and pin it down and write about it. And so the idea of time swirling became a really big, meaningful part of the book. And so the structure itself became a form of meaning. It wasn't just a way to tell the story, it was a way to enhance some of the ideas of growing up Christian and relating to time, or a lack of understanding of time. Yeah, character development is an interesting one in memoir because you're the character, and I had to reckon early on in the writing with this idea that, am I the hero of my narrative? And when that question emerged, I felt really dirty because I realized that I had been writing myself as the hero of my narrative, and that felt really wrong. And I think naturally it's wish fulfillment, right? You write your story and you become the hero. Isn't that what everyone wants to do? And again, if you wanted to write a nuanced story, which I did, I knew that it had to be something where I was essentially flawed. And that really changed how I was looking at things too. Because that was revising. If you were going to always be like, something bad was happening and I talk about what's going on in my head, and it's like, that's the real truth. Whatever I'm thinking is the thing that I want the reader to be like, that's right, I empathize with you. But I think empathy works better when we see that narrator struggling through something and maybe making a series of bad choices or whatever it is, or not responding well to a situation, because that's more relatable. In terms of memory and thinking about, well, do you remember all these conversations? How dare you use dialogue, and how dare you make characters out of people loved ones that you don't own their stories. I mean, that's a really long conversation, but for me, early on, the reason I started writing memoir was I had remembered the story, and this is in the book, of being stung by a bunch of bees on my 3rd birthday. It was actually hornets. There was a hornet's nest on this slide, and I had jostled it for climbing up and got stung many times. And my father, who was still alive at the time, kind of grabbed me, swooped me into the house, and kind of dunked my head into an ice bucket. And which, that should have been I should have flagged that memory at first, being like, what is the impulse to take child dunk into bucket? But when I brought that up in my 20s to my sister, who's 6 years older than me, she said, that didn't happen to you. She said, that happened to me. And I was like, what? Because I've been terrified of bees my whole life. I fixed it because bees are important. I've learned to adjust my beliefs. But I was really scared for a really long time. And so that sense memory was so powerful that it didn't matter. So we asked my mom, we said, hey, who got stung by all those bees? And she goes, someone got stung when we lived in that house. And so she had no memory. My dad, had since passed. There was no arbiter to tell what the real story was. So all I knew is that the truth of the experience was that I was terrified of bees. So it almost didn't matter what the fact was. And this gets into interesting territory, fact versus truth and all that. But I knew that my identity had been formed in some way by this probably misremembered memory. Because if you think about it, or if I think about it, the memory of the ice bucket is in a different bathroom, like at a different house, like the one we moved to a year later. And so if I reconstruct it, I can see that I've sort of hybridized it into a half dream, half like collage of things. And so there's a really good chance that it wasn't me. But that didn't affect the, solid 18 to 20 years of running, screaming, flinging flip-flops at hornets and bees whenever they came around me. So that was kind of the impetus for that. And that's how I approached memory from then on, which was, can I get to something that, even if I can't get the factual recorded record of this conversation, what is the truth of that experience that shaped me or shaped, the conditions around me? Yeah. I mean, when you're dealing with real experiences that involve other people, especially when they may not think that they look that great, they're not in the best light. It's a really, really hard concept to wrap your head around. And there are nights, in the months before the book came out, I started thinking, who do I think I am? I can't tell the story. One, it's not important enough. I was reading Infinite Jest at the time by David Foster Wallace, and so everything felt meaningless anyway in terms of how dare I produce something. And then thinking about, did I do justice to these people? Are they going to sue me for libel? And then these real things you have to think about. And I would just keep rereading it, and I knew that the spirit in which I was writing was something that was about the search for meaning and my own story. And you have to own that. And I think for growing up Christian, for me, in my experience, I was not taught to own my own story. I was not taught how to ask questions about doubt, about things that weren't lining up, about endings in eternity, about death and the ever after. And so those thoughts would creep in, and I thought, no, that's an old form of oppression, to squelch a story, to squelch a narrative, to feel that your own narrative isn't worth telling. So to step out and do that it kind of, I continually had to take that risk and say, these people are in there. I know I've done it the best justice that I can. It's not opining. I'm not trying to attack anyone. And I didn't, like I said, I didn't add those reflective statements that said, wasn't this person awful in this moment? And many of those people I love dearly, or at least have some respect for, and many of them are not even the same way that they were when I was in first grade. So I just hope that people have understood that. I have not heard anything so far about anyone that's upset about the way they were portrayed. People have really received it well, and I think they wanted to ask those questions, and I think it was a surprise to them to even know that this story existed from the way that I was perceiving it. I think for me, what I want readers to take away from the book is, it's called Wake Sleeper, and that has a number of connotations, both literal and not. And I thought of it as a wake-up call to myself to be able to start asking the questions that I wasn't taught how to ask. But I think on a bigger level, it was also that I found it harder in any circumstance, whether it was a Christian crowd or not, to talk about the bigger questions of existence and spirituality, or lack thereof, or whatever it was. And the more that my writings were being distributed among my group, the more those conversations started happening organically, over, at a party or something like that. It wasn't like a real rigorous sit-down chat. It was like you're drinking some beers and you're talking about this stuff. And there people that were like, I've never really talked about this before. And that really excited me, and I thought that's what I want this book to do, is to give people permission to ask those questions no matter where they are at in terms of belief or unbelief. That as a culture we've learned to stifle a lot of those questions, and you keep your routine sustainable and in the moment, and there's something to that. But I also realized that because I hadn't asked those questions for so long, it had just rattled around my brain to the point of like mania, and writing the book became a way to get that out there and hopefully liberate people to ask those same questions. It's such a constant negotiation, and different projects require different processes. But for me, I have to handwrite. I have to handwrite things I care about. In college, I would type essays because you're not as invested in that area usually, because you're just trying to bang it out. You don't have time to sit with it, and writing really needs time. And that's a hard thing to learn. So for a way to slow myself down is that I handwrite everything in a sort of pocket-sized notebook with graph paper, so very small, lots of grids and that kind of thing. And we'll write in that. And then when I feel like I've got a good enough chunk that I know is not there, but it has crested something and turned some corner, and it's not just junk that I'm going to cut, I'll then type it up on a computer. And that's the first major edit. There's a lot that happens. There's a lot of new material that happens there, and it's an act of translation. I mean, that's from brain to page is a translation, no matter what you're doing. So the first act of translation is brain to notebook with pen or pencil, and then notebook to word processor of some kind. So there's multiple translations, which allows you to see the work in a new way each time, and to be brutal with it if you need to. I find it very liberating to slash a pen through a page that I know is not going to work. It's different when you have to hold down the delete key or just highlight something and then it's gone. There's nothing weighty and physical about it. So I find that it helps to do that in this more analog way, and then move it to the digital, and then start playing with it more like patterns and puzzles, and because then you can have multiple documents and versions open, and you give yourself permission to slash and burn or reorganize and think, maybe this middle section is my ending, and you can move it because it's like, well, I've got the backup file. And so in a way, it's tricking yourself into thinking that it's tricking yourself out of the misguided belief that you have all these rules you have to conform to. Richard Hugo says in Triggering Town, look over your shoulder when you're writing. No one is there. And so it's kind of creating a process that allows me to be liberated in that way, and to remember, look over your shoulder. There isn't anyone guiding how you're supposed to do this. And so if you want to make this move, just make it. Great question. I feel like wanting to be a writer is this thing that you keep trying to talk yourself out of, and you can't, because you keep thinking everything else is so much more practical, and it's the art world is not what it was in the patronage system and the world of Tennyson and things like that. So it's like, well, you should do something else. If you're artistically minded, then go work at an arts nonprofit and just put all your energy into that, and that'll be helping people. So it took a lot to own the confidence and the fact that this wasn't going to go away, that if I ignored this, it was going to ruin my life. I mean, I found that when I don't write for long periods of time, or I don't have the output for it or the outlet for it, I become very cynical, and I can't sit through a movie without critiquing everything about it, and people will come away with like these very simple, positive things from whatever it is. And I'm just like, yeah, but you could tell that the soundtrack to that was like meant to amplify the emotional impact. And it's just manipulation, isn't it? Isn't that what all pop music is? Isn't that what Adele is? She's just emotional manipulation. And I would see people's faces be like, you get confused and really sad. And I was like, I'm ruining everyone's life by not having my own output. And so when I would write, I would realize I would get that out in some other fashion, some healthier way. So I think when I realized that I was actually a writer and that I couldn't ignore it was after college. I was still writing, and that's when I didn't know what creative nonfiction was, but I was writing that. And so discovering a name for it was a very empowering moment to be like, yes, this is what I am, because I can't write fiction, and I love writing poetry, and I still do it, but I didn't feel that I could own the label as poet. I didn't feel like I understood the history enough to feel like I was a practitioner or an artisan of that. So finding creative nonfiction was like, there's a place for me, and all of a sudden that road opened, and I was like, I don't know where it's going, but I know it's there, and I can just keep plugging away at it. So right now I know I just said that I can't own the label as a poet, but that's what I've been writing for the last 3 years or so. And I started commuting on the train to Boston. I live north of Boston, and it's a 35-minute train ride on the commuter rail, and then another 15 on the subway. And I found that is the perfect time to write and to read. And so, having a full-time day job, working part-time as a creative writing faculty member, being a husband, being a dad. This is a really busy life, and I would read all these interviews with authors about you steal whatever time you can get, and I was always so bad at that because I just feel like I need more sleep than most authors. What an absurd statement. But when I started taking the train, there's a quiet car on our commuter rail, and everyone understands that you don't talk and you don't talk on your phone, and it's wonderful. And so I started writing, and it's become the most habitual writing and reading time that I've had since grad school, and it's so great. And so I've got all this new work. And in terms of what I was saying before about structure and discovery, I'm kind of writing towards that. Right now, it's very much influenced by the train, about the concept of not moving but being moved. And I'm teasing that out, and I know this sounds a little bit abstract because it is at the moment, and it's finding its voice. But it's really exciting, and I think that what it's going to turn into is sort of this hybrid essay poem that's even further towards poem than Wake Sleeper. And I'm trying to conceive of it as a chapbook for now, but I'm hoping for a longer manuscript and also collaborating with other artists in my hometown. It's a really robust community of musicians and visual artists, and so there's already some collaboration with, kind of, I guess, ekphrasis, and, projects that may have a written and an audio component and that sort of thing.